It would be 2 years until the world finally got more sentient creatures that use cell phones. Once again developed by Natsume and published by Smilesoft, the two games were released in April of 2002, in power and speed versions. They came bundled with a new model of the power antenna, designed for the Game Boy Advance. Just like the first game's model, the light starts flashing whenever you get called in-game. And just like the first game's model, it's more or less completely and utterly useless. The game begins with naming the protagonist, canonically named Kyo. The school day has ended, and as usual, he is excited to go learn more about the Denjuu world. Several years have passed since the events of Telefang 1, and the Denjuu world hasn't quite been the same. All antenna trees except for one have withered, so traveling between the human and Denjuu worlds isn't quite as easy. A team of explorers was sent to discover what's going on, and the story starts on the day they were supposed to return to the human world. The fathers of the protagonist and his girl, white space friend, were part of this team, but they lost contact with them. Matsukiyo, the nerd from Telefang 1 who spends the entire game chilling out with the suspicious turtle, is now a Denjuu researcher who works in the town where the protagonist lives. There's also this Mo-san guy who sometimes tells the protagonist the tales of his adventures in the Denjuu world. Originally, I thought the game implied that this guy is supposed to be Shigeki, the previous game's protagonist, but after doing some research it turns out that he's just a character from the Telefang 1 manga. This Moriyoshi guy never appears in the original game. So yes, continuity just went flying out the window. And unfortunately, that's not the only time it happens. The protagonist and his friends are invited to go to the Denjuu world to find their fathers, and thus begins your adventure. Regardless of the version you're playing, your starter is Rex, an armadillo sort of thing that kind of resembles Crypto. Like the first game, your ultimate goal is to befriend every Denjuu, which generally involves beating the living heck out of them so that you get their phone number. There are just a couple of problems I have with that. The first is that I don't like half of the new Denjuu. There are some genuinely cool designs, like the starter, the two rival Denjuu, the villain, and some others. But then there are creatures that instead of looking weirdly cool, just look weird, either due to their shape or the garish colors. Or both. I mean, what is this? Or this? Or this? Or this? Oh wait, that's a Pokemon. For some reason, the new Denjuu also don't have separate names for their evolutions. And speaking of evolutions, some of them barely resemble their pre-evolved form. Telefang 1 had its share of weird designs, but not to this level. It's especially jarring because every evolutionary tree uses the base form for their overworld sprite. So you end up seeing this thing outside of battle, and then this thing in battle. This happens throughout the whole game, even with the antagonist. If you can even call it an antagonist anyway. The other problem is that there are only a handful of returning Denjuu. They aren't merely unavailable like what happened with Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, they straight up are not in the game. The few that are in the game had some of their evolutions removed for some reason. The worst part is what they did to Crypto, and by that I mean that he just doesn't appear. At all. Crypto is the most recognizable of all Denjuu in the original games, but he's nowhere to be seen. The biggest improvement in Telefang 2 is easily the battles. The first thing you'll notice is that it now has proper backgrounds, back sprites, and even a second sprite for attacking. It's a lot more flashy this time around. You can now also check some basic info about both allied and enemy Denjuu by pressing L and R respectively. Denjuu retain the 6 types of the previous games, but moves now have their own types, and Denjuu types not only have move types that they are weak and resistant against, but also very weak and very resistant against. There are big strategical implications just with this simple change, and battles now have more options than simply picking the Denjuu with the right type. That said, all Denjuu do have a reserve normal move that is neither strong nor weak against any type. Denma attacks have also changed. Instead of having to charge for a couple of turns, they use Denma points, or DP for short. This makes them more reliable, while at the same time making you think whether you want to use a powerful Denma attack or save the DP in case you find a more dangerous opponent. Or just spam and use an item to recover it, I guess. The player also gets his own turn where he can use a variety of items, like for recovering HP, healing status effects, powering up stats, etc. Since HP and some status effects don't heal after battle, you want to keep at least a bare minimum in your inventory. You can also earn a variety of items from winning a battle. This wasn't as well balanced as it could be, however. Healing items are extremely cheap, so you will always have a ton of them, meaning you can easily heal what little damage enemies deal. I only started running out on the final dungeon, but by then it didn't matter that much because battles there give a ton of experience points and my Denjuu ended up horribly over-leveled. And on the subject of dungeons, Telefang 2 does not have a Cactus Ruins. Instead, it has a Cactus West third of the game. Every single dungeon in the west third of the game is a long, boring slog that feels like it was designed purely to waste your time. They are filled with paths that lead to dead ends, chests with useless items in them, switches that open doors on the other side of the map, and of course the wild Denjuu. See, on top of the graphical overhaul, the world now also has wild Denjuu wandering around. Instead of random battles, getting too close to the wild beasties will trigger a battle, and now they come in groups too instead of individually. Some places also have barrels and vases lying around, which can now be used to stun the wild Denjuu for a few moments. Or at least, that's how it is in theory. In practice, you will be forced into battles because dungeons are too narrow to avoid the wild Denjuu and there are barely any barrels or vases to pick up and throw. Another change is evolution. It's done in mostly the same way as the first game, but lab evolutions have been removed and fusion evolutions can now be freely reverted whenever you wish. It also uses any item from a certain category to evolve, instead of one specific item. These items are associated with one of the 6 Denjuu types, and the resulting evolution will be of that type. I'd say that this removes weight from deciding whether to wait for natural evolution that is ultimately more powerful, or just evolve right now even if at the end it's less powerful. But that's just nitpicking and trying to find something to criticize. I also don't want to slam the game's story too much because I know that it's not the focus, but I have to mention that the ending is basically getting slapped with a moral lesson and that some of the characters are just plain annoying. You have this loser who really wants to get in your friend's pants, these people, if you can even call them that, who get away with everything they did with only a pat in the back. And the final boss, who you only have to fight because the game needed a final boss, not because you actually had any real reason to. I played through the game once before, but it was years ago and I needed a refresher and footage to make this video. I remember thinking that the game dragged on a bit, but not to this point. Once the credits ended, I closed the game and said to myself that I wouldn't touch it again anytime soon. As for the music, I don't like it as much as the prequels, but it's still on the good side. The overworld and battle themes are once again the highlights, but the tracks used in some dungeons will inevitably get old, since you'll be stuck in some of them for way too long. I'm sure you can tell that Telefang 2 didn't grab me like its predecessor. It has a lot of genuine improvements in regards to battles, which was easily the weakest link in Telefang 1, but I feel like it lost part of its charm. The fact that the original Denjuu really got the short end of the stick is my biggest problem with it, because it seems completely backwards. I mean, they make a game about befriending a ton of monsters and then just completely ignore almost all of the existing ones for the sequel? I understand that they want the new set of Denjuu to be in the spotlight, but surely there was a better way to solve that. Still, despite all that, it might be worth checking out if you're interested in monster catching games or enjoyed Telefang 1. A few of my problems with Telefang 2 are highly subjective and I'm probably straight up biased towards Telefang 1, so there's a chance that you will have a better opinion of it than I do. Unfortunately, and also unsurprisingly, the games have no official English release. However, there were also bootlegs of it. I haven't touched those, but from the little I've seen it doesn't seem like they are all that great. Which is also unsurprising. These would also be the last breath of the short-lived series. While I haven't found any concrete numbers, sales don't seem to have been particularly great, neither for the first game nor for the sequels, so it's safe to say that Telefang is dead and buried. The DS and 3DS would have been good places to try and revive the franchise, either with a completely new game or a remake of the original, but as we all know, that never happened. As for Smilesoft, they rebranded themselves to Rocket Company in 2003 after the president, Shuhei Ida, was arrested and charged with child pornography. Apparently, he convinced a 15-year-old student to do stuff with him in exchange for 50,000 yen, and in a fantastic display of irony, a cell phone. However, at some point he was released and became the representative director of Rocket Company. I couldn't find much info on what happened after the arrest. Either way, they published several games exclusively in Japan, although the only noteworthy one of those were the Medabots games for the DS and 3DS. In 2016, they merged with Imagineer, their parent company. Natsume's case is a bit complicated too, but in short, the Natsume in question, Natsume Company, now known as Natsume Atari, isn't the same company that published the much more successful Harvest Moon and Wolfia games, but a different company that also split from the original Natsume in 1995, 5 years before the release of the original Telefang games. Rip in pieces, Telefang. Rip in pieces. May you and Robopon warm each other in the cold graveyard of Pokemon wannabes.